There are people who will never raise their voice, yet still manage to move your world like a storm you never saw coming. They do not always arrive with cruelty on their face, but with charm, with patience, with words that seem gentle until you realize they are shaping your thoughts more than you are. And somewhere along that quiet distortion, you begin to question your own knowing, your own strength, your own light. But let me tell you this, there comes a moment when the soul wakes up, when the heart remembers its own language again, and when you finally see that what was called confusion was never yours to carry. In that moment, you are no longer learning how to survive them. You are learning how to return to yourself, untouched, unbroken, and fully aware. There is a victory the world rarely teaches us to recognize because it does not look like triumph in the usual sense. It does not arrive with noise, with confrontation, or with the satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, it comes quietly, almost invisibly, in the moment you no longer feel the pull to react, to defend, or to prove your worth to those who misunderstand it. And in that stillness, something profound unfolds. You begin to see that true strength was never in the battle at all, but in the ability to remain whole while others try to disturb your peace. Because when you are no longer controlled by reaction, you are no longer available to manipulation, and what once had power over your emotions simply loses its place in your life. There is a subtle awakening that begins here, a shift so gentle it almost goes unnoticed at first. You start to recognize patterns you once lived inside without question. The repeated confusion after certain conversations, the feeling of being slightly off balance after interactions that seemed ordinary on the surface, the quiet doubt that followed words meant to guide, but somehow always left you smaller than before. And in that recognition, something within you begins to straighten, not in anger, not in resistance, but in clarity. Because clarity is the first light that breaks the illusion, and once you see, even faintly, you can never fully return to what you once accepted blindly. This is where awareness becomes power, not the kind of power that dominates, but the kind that liberates. When you begin to recognize manipulation for what it is, you are no longer participating in it unconsciously. You are no longer moving through it as if it were truth. Instead, you are standing slightly outside of it, observing it for what it truly is, a pattern that relies on your confusion, your hesitation, your need to explain and justify yourself endlessly. And when that need begins to fade, so does the control it once had over you. It is not always dramatic. More often it is quiet. You begin to pause before responding where you once rushed to explain. You begin to feel less urgency to be understood by those who consistently misunderstand you. You begin to notice that your peace is not something to be negotiated in every interaction, but something to be protected with gentle firmness. And in those small, almost invisible shifts, you are reclaiming something that was always yours, your emotional independence. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: manipulation only survives where awareness is absent. It does not need force to continue. It only needs unawareness, repetition, and emotional entanglement. But the moment you see it clearly, even once, the structure begins to weaken. Not because you fought it, but because you stopped feeding it unconsciously. Awareness does not shout, it dissolves. It does not destroy others, it returns you to yourself. And in that return, you discover something far greater than victory over anyone else. You discover the quiet, unshakable strength of no longer being reachable through confusion. Manipulators thrive where silence replaces boundaries, not because silence is weakness, but because silence without awareness becomes an open door. When we do not name what disturbs us, we often begin to accommodate it. Not all at once, not in dramatic surrender, but in small adjustments that feel harmless in the moment. We soften our discomfort to avoid conflict. We delay our truth to preserve peace. We explain away what our intuition already understands, and in doing so, we unknowingly teach others how far they can go without being held accountable. There is a quiet pattern in human behavior where what is unspoken slowly becomes what is accepted. A crossed line, when not acknowledged, begins to lose its sharpness in our own perception. We start to question whether it was ever truly a boundary at all. This is how emotional confusion takes root, not through force, but through repetition without resistance. And the more we stay silent in moments that require clarity, the more we begin to negotiate with our own discomfort instead of honoring it. But something shifts when awareness enters. It does not arrive with anger, it arrives with precision. You begin to notice that your silence was never empty. It was full of meaning you had not yet given words to. And once you begin to name what you feel, even gently, you interrupt the pattern. You bring shape to what was previously blurred. You allow truth to exist outside your internal struggle, where it can no longer be reinterpreted against you. This is where boundaries begin to take form, not as walls built in hostility, but as lines drawn in self-respect. A boundary is not an attack. It is a declaration of presence. It says, without unnecessary explanation, that I recognize myself here, and I will not abandon that recognition for comfort, approval, or fear of being misunderstood. And interestingly, when boundaries are expressed with calm certainty, they do not always create distance. They create clarity, and clarity is something manipulation cannot easily survive. What you do not name, you unconsciously allow, and what you repeatedly allow begins to feel normal even when it is not right. This is why silence, when misused, can slowly erode self-trust. Because each time you override your inner voice, you weaken the relationship you have with it. But the moment you begin to speak your truth, even imperfectly, even softly, you begin to rebuild that trust. You start to realize that your voice was never too much. It was simply unused in the places where it mattered most. And over time, something powerful unfolds. You stop confusing tolerance with strength. You stop mistaking endurance for wisdom. Instead, you begin to understand that real strength is not in absorbing what harms you quietly, but in recognizing it early enough to respond with clarity. In that recognition, silence transforms. It is no longer absence, it becomes intention. And boundaries are no longer reactions. They become reflections of a self that finally refuses to disappear in the presence of what diminishes it. There is a voice within you that rarely competes for attention. It does not shout, it does not argue, and it does not try to convince you in the way fear or doubt often does. Instead, it speaks in a quieter language, through a subtle discomfort, a gentle hesitation, a feeling that something is slightly misaligned even when everything appears acceptable on the surface. And too often this voice is dismissed as overthinking, as emotional uncertainty, or as something to ignore in favor of what seems more logical or socially acceptable. But intuition has never been confusion. It is recognition before explanation, awareness before proof, truth before validation. The challenge is not that this inner voice is unclear, but that we are conditioned to distrust it. We are taught to look outside ourselves for confirmation, to rely on external approval before we trust what we already feel within. So when intuition speaks, we hesitate, we analyze it, we question it, we negotiate with it, as though clarity must always arrive with evidence that others can see. But intuition does not operate in the language of external certainty. It operates in the language of internal alignment. It tells you when something feels safe long before you can explain why, and it tells you when something feels off, even when everything appears perfectly constructed. There are moments when this inner knowing tries to protect you, but you override it in the name of understanding, patience, or giving things more time. You stay in conversations that leave you drained because nothing objectively wrong was said. You remain in situations that slowly erode your peace because no clear reason justifies your discomfort, and yet the body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize. The unease lingers, the quiet tension returns, because intuition does not disappear just because it is ignored. It simply waits for you to return to it. Trusting this inner truth is not about reacting impulsively or assuming every feeling is absolute fact. It is about learning to sit with your own perception without immediately invalidating it. It is about allowing space for your inner response to exist without rushing to dismiss it. Over time, you begin to notice a pattern. The moments you listened to that quiet inner signal often saved you from unnecessary confusion, while the moments you ignored it often required explanation, recovery, or emotional repair. And slowly, something within you strengthens. You begin to realize that intuition is not separate from intelligence, it is a deeper form of it. It integrates what you have experienced, what you have sensed, and what you have learned in ways that are not always immediately verbal, but are consistently accurate in their emotional clarity. And when you begin to trust it, you stop abandoning yourself in real time. This is where protection begins, not in defensiveness, but in awareness. Because the more you listen to that quiet inner truth, the less you need to be convinced by what does not align with it. You stop forcing yourself into spaces that require you to ignore your own signals. You stop explaining away what you already understand. And in that alignment, intuition becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a form of self-respect that guides you back to yourself again and again, without needing permission from anything outside of you. Not every battle deserves your voice, because not every disturbance is asking for your participation. Some moments are designed to pull you out of yourself, to lure you into proving what was never truly in question, and to drain your clarity in the process. There are exchanges that invite you not for understanding, but for reaction, where the more you speak, the further you drift from your own center. And wisdom begins to form when you recognize that your voice is not meant to be scattered across every misunderstanding, but preserved for the moments that truly require your truth. There is a difference between response and reaction that most people only learn through experience. Reaction is immediate, emotional, and often shaped by the urgency of being seen or defended. It rises quickly, almost instinctively, as though silence itself would mean surrender. But response is something slower, more grounded. It does not rush to fill space. It observes first, listens fully, and then speaks only when speech adds clarity instead of noise. In this space between reaction and response, self-respect begins to mature. Every boundary you hold is an expression of how you value your own inner world. Yet boundaries are not always enforced through confrontation. Sometimes they are maintained through restraint. There are situations where saying less is not avoidance, but awareness, where stepping back is not weakness, but precision. Because when you engage with everything that provokes you, you slowly hand over control of your emotional landscape to external forces that were never meant to govern it. It is not always easy to distinguish when to speak and when to remain still. The pressure to justify yourself can feel overwhelming, especially when misunderstanding is directed toward you. There is a natural desire to correct perception, to repair distortion, to be fully seen and accurately interpreted. But not every distortion is yours to fix. Not every misunderstanding is yours to resolve. And not every voice that challenges you is rooted in truth-seeking. Some are rooted in control, and others in confusion that has no interest in clarity. Wisdom begins when you realize that protecting your peace sometimes requires you to let certain narratives exist without your participation. You do not need to enter every space where your name is spoken. You do not need to correct every version of yourself that others misunderstand, because your identity is not built in the minds of those who distort it, but in the integrity with which you choose to live it. And as this understanding deepens, something within you becomes more still. You begin to pause where you once rushed. You begin to choose silence where you once felt obligated to explain. You begin to see that not every provocation deserves a response, but every boundary you hold deserves your respect. Not because boundaries are rigid structures, but because they are reminders of where you end and where unnecessary disturbance does not get to enter. In this quiet discipline, you discover a different kind of strength. Not the strength of being constantly engaged, but the strength of being intentionally selective. And in that selectiveness, you are no longer easily moved by every emotional wave that passes through your life. You remain present, but not pulled, aware, but not entangled. And that is where wisdom stops being something you learn and becomes something you live. There are forms of attention that arrive dressed in softness, carrying words that sound like care, concern, even devotion. At first, they feel comforting, almost reassuring, as if someone is looking closely enough at your life to guide you through it. But not all guidance is rooted in freedom. Some of it is shaped by quiet possession, where love is no longer an offering, but a subtle expectation of compliance. And in such spaces, what is called care can slowly begin to feel like restriction, not because it is loud or forceful, but because it gradually narrows the space in which you are allowed to be fully yourself. At the beginning, it rarely appears as control. It often comes through suggestions, through concern that sounds reasonable, through involvement that feels attentive. You are told what is best for you, not as a demand, but as a protective voice. And because it is wrapped in familiarity or emotional closeness, you may not immediately question it. You may even interpret it as affection, as someone investing in your well-being. But over time, something subtle begins to shift. Your choices become slightly more questioned. Your instincts are gently redirected. Your independence is met with quiet resistance disguised as worry. This is how control becomes difficult to recognize. It does not always oppose you directly. Sometimes it surrounds you so closely that it begins to feel like safety. And when care becomes conditional on agreement, when concern only feels present if you align with it, then it is no longer care in its purest form, because genuine care expands you. It does not reduce your ability to think, choose, or become. It does not ask you to shrink your perspective in order to maintain connection. There is a quiet moment of realization that often comes later when you notice how certain relationships leave you feeling slightly smaller than you were before. Not through obvious harm, but through repeated subtle adjustments you made to maintain peace or approval. You begin to see how often you softened your truth to avoid discomfort, how frequently you paused your own instincts to preserve harmony, and how gradually your inner voice became quieter in spaces where it should have been heard the most. And in that recognition, clarity begins to return. You start to understand that love, in its healthiest form, does not require the diminishing of self. It does not ask you to abandon your inner knowing in order to be accepted. It does not thrive in environments where one person grows only as much as the other allows. Instead, real care creates space. It allows questions without fear. It permits difference without punishment. It trusts your capacity to choose, even when your choices do not mirror its expectations. When you begin to see this clearly, you also begin to reclaim something essential, your sense of proportion in relationships. You stop mistaking intensity for depth. You stop confusing attachment with understanding. And slowly, you learn to measure connection not by how tightly it holds you, but by how freely you can still become yourself within it. Because anything that consistently requires you to reduce your voice, narrow your path, or silence your intuition in order to preserve it is not love in its fullest sense. Love, when it is honest, does not ask you to disappear in order to belong. There comes a quiet turning point in life when you realize that explanation is not always the bridge to understanding, and sometimes it is only a doorway to further distortion. For a long time, you may have believed that if you could just find the right words, the right tone, the right amount of detail, then you would finally be understood. So you speak more, you clarify more, you justify more, hoping that sincerity alone will be enough to dissolve misunderstanding. But not every listener is listening to understand. Some are listening to respond, to question, to challenge, or to reshape your truth into something easier for them to accept. And slowly, through repetition, something begins to shift inside you. You start to notice that certain conversations do not end in clarity, no matter how carefully you explain yourself. Instead, they end in exhaustion. You find yourself replaying your words long after they are spoken, wondering if you could have said it differently, better, softer, stronger. And in that endless internal revision, you begin to lose something subtle but important, your sense of inner certainty, because the more you try to perfect your explanation for those committed to misunderstanding, the more you begin to doubt the validity of your own experience. There is a deeper truth that reveals itself only with time. Understanding is not always the result of clearer explanation, but of willingness to see, and willingness cannot be forced through words. No matter how precise your language becomes, it cannot create openness where openness is absent. This is where peace begins to take shape, not in being perfectly understood by everyone, but in no longer needing to be. When you stop explaining yourself to the wrong people, something remarkable happens. The emotional weight begins to lift. You no longer carry the invisible burden of managing how every version of you is perceived. You no longer feel responsible for correcting every misunderstanding or softening every misinterpretation. Instead, you begin to conserve your energy for spaces where your truth is not interrogated, but received. This shift is not about indifference. It is about clarity, because clarity is not cold, it is clean. It removes the unnecessary noise of justification and leaves only what is essential, your awareness of who you are, regardless of how others choose to interpret it. And in that awareness, you begin to feel a kind of peace that does not depend on external agreement. It exists because you are no longer negotiating your identity for acceptance. You also begin to understand that constant explanation can sometimes be a subtle form of self-abandonment. Each time you overextend your truth to convince someone who has already decided not to see it, you move slightly further away from your own center. But when you choose not to engage in that cycle, you return to yourself. You allow your energy to settle where it belongs, within your own understanding, rather than in endless correction of external perception. And in that return, peace is no longer something you chase through being understood. It becomes something you experience through no longer needing to be. There is a moment in emotional growth when you begin to notice that certain patterns no longer reach you the way they once did. The same words that used to pull you into reaction now pass through you without disturbance. The same emotional pressure that once demanded immediate response now meets something quieter within you, space. And in that space, something powerful happens. The hook that once caught your attention no longer finds purchase, not because the situation has changed, but because you have. For a long time, emotional hooks work because they rely on reflex. They rely on urgency, on the need to explain, to defend, to restore balance in moments that feel emotionally unstable. They thrive in environments where reaction is immediate and reflection is delayed. But when you begin to create even a small gap between what you feel and how you respond, the entire structure starts to weaken. That gap is not emptiness. It is awareness taking its first real breath. Detachment, in this sense, is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of feeling, nor the refusal to care. It is the refinement of where your care is placed and how your energy is distributed. It is the ability to feel without being consumed, to observe without being pulled into every emotional current that passes through your life. And in that refinement, something shifts in the way you experience yourself. You are no longer available to every provocation. You are no longer easily drawn into emotional cycles that lead nowhere except exhaustion. There is a quiet strength in no longer reacting to what once controlled your emotional rhythm. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is simply the absence of unnecessary engagement. And over time, that absence becomes stability. You begin to notice that your peace is no longer something that depends on how others behave, but something that exists regardless of external behavior. That is where emotional independence begins to take root. And then there is silence, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of intention. When chosen consciously, silence is not emptiness. It is communication stripped of excess. It is the refusal to give energy to what does not deserve continuation. It is the understanding that not every distortion requires correction, and not every emotional pull requires response. In that silence, you are not disappearing. You are repositioning yourself. What many fail to recognize is that silence, when grounded in awareness, carries its own language. It communicates boundaries without confrontation, clarity without argument, and strength without display. It does not beg to be understood. It simply stands as it is. And for those who are accustomed to gaining control through reaction, this kind of silence becomes unfamiliar, even unsettling, because it no longer offers them the emotional response they once relied on. But for you, this silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes a space where your thoughts are no longer interrupted by constant justification. It becomes a place where your energy is no longer scattered across unnecessary engagement. It becomes a form of protection that does not require force, only awareness. And in that combination, detachment and intentional silence, you begin to experience a different kind of freedom. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom from being pulled away from yourself. Become your identity. It looks like holding your ground without needing to push others off theirs. And in a world that often confuses reaction with power, this kind of steadiness can be easily overlooked. But it is precisely this steadiness that marks true inner strength. There is a point where you begin to notice that integrity is not something you perform when it is easy. It is something you return to when it is tested. It is the quiet decision to remain consistent with your values, even when inconsistency might feel more satisfying in the moment. It is the choice to stay aligned with your own sense of rightness, even when others try to redefine it for you. And in that choice, something remarkable happens. You stop being shaped by external pressure and start being guided by internal truth. This does not mean you become unaffected. It means you become anchored. You still feel, you still recognize, you still understand what is happening around you, but you are no longer easily displaced by it. You no longer abandon your center just because someone else is off balance. Instead, you learn to observe without absorption, to respond without imitation, to remain present without losing yourself in what is unfolding around you. And slowly, a different kind of confidence emerges, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that does not need it, the kind that does not rise or fall depending on how others behave, the kind that remains steady because it is built on something unchanging within you. This is what it means to become unshakably yourself, not untouched by life, but unchanged in essence by what tries to pull you away from it. In that state, integrity is no longer a rule you follow. It becomes the ground you stand on. There is a kind of victory that does not announce itself with noise, celebration, or the satisfaction of proving someone wrong. It is quieter than that, and because of its silence, it is often misunderstood. Many are taught to associate victory with response, with the need to correct, to expose, to match energy with energy until balance feels restored. But there comes a moment in deeper emotional maturity when you begin to see that reacting is not the same as regaining power. In fact, constant reaction can sometimes be the very thing that keeps you tied to what you are trying to leave behind. The shift begins subtly. At first, you still feel the pull to respond. There is a familiar urge to defend your perspective, to make sure your truth is fully understood, to ensure that silence is not mistaken for weakness. But slowly, you begin to notice something different within yourself. You start to see that not every moment requires your participation. Not every opinion deserves your energy. Not every provocation is asking for your engagement. It is often simply waiting for it. And in that realization, the need to respond begins to lose its urgency. Unbothered self-possession is not indifference. It is not emotional absence or detachment from reality. It is presence without dependence. It is the ability to remain fully aware of what is happening without allowing it to pull you away from your center. You still see clearly, you still understand deeply, but you are no longer easily displaced by what you see. There is a groundedness that begins to form within you, where your emotional state is no longer dictated by external stimulation. This is where control begins to dissolve, not because circumstances change, but because your reaction to them changes. Control, in many subtle forms, often relies on emotional engagement. It thrives on response, on reaction, on the invisible thread that keeps you connected to what disturbs you. But when that thread weakens, when you no longer feel compelled to respond to every emotional invitation, something shifts. The dynamic loses its grip, not through confrontation, but through withdrawal of unnecessary participation. There is a profound strength in not needing to win every exchange, in not needing to have the final word, in not needing to correct every misunderstanding that is not rooted in genuine openness. Because when your peace becomes more important than your participation in emotional chaos, you begin to reclaim something essential, your own internal authority. And that authority does not require validation. It is felt in your stillness, in your restraint, in your ability to remain steady when pressure tries to move you. Over time, you begin to recognize that many of the battles you once engaged in were not battles for truth, but battles for emotional equilibrium. You were not always seeking resolution. You were seeking relief from discomfort. But relief does not always come from engagement. Sometimes it comes from stepping out of the cycle entirely, from choosing not to be pulled into what does not deserve your presence. And in that choice, something quietly powerful emerges. You realize that the ultimate victory was never about defeating anything outside of you. It was about reaching a place where nothing external can easily disrupt what is stable within you. When you are no longer reacting on demand, you are no longer controlled by what once sought to define your emotional state. And in that stillness, you find a freedom that does not need to be announced. It simply exists.